The house possessed a particular kind of silence that only grew in the suburbs after 9 o'clock. A heavy, wool-lined quiet that tasted faintly of dust and old dinner. In his bedroom, Thomas lay flat on his back, his eyes locked onto the ceiling where the plastic glow-in-the-dark stars he'd glued up at 7 years old were losing their luminescence. They didn't shine anymore. They just decayed into a sickly, jaundiced green. He was 12, an age where his skin felt too tight for his bones and his chest felt constantly packed with dry kindling, waiting for a spark he didn't know how to strike. "I'm done," he whispered to the dark. He liked the shape of the words. They had a sharp, metallic edge, like the utility knives his father used to keep in the breast pocket of his denim shirts. "I don't need this house. I don't need any of it." The voice in his head didn't belong to a ghost. Not yet. It was just his own tongue, practicing the theater of rebellion. He'd spent hours choreographing the exact moment of his exit. The dramatic slam of the front door, the heavy, deliberate crunch of his sneakers on the gravel driveway, leaving them behind to figure out what they'd lost. It was an elaborate, beautiful injury he wanted to inflict on them, mostly because he couldn't understand why his own skin felt so constantly bruised. But lately, the internal monologue had started to feel heavy, like a wet coat he couldn't pull off. It had a rhythm that didn't feel entirely like his own anymore. It was slower, more rhythmic, a dull thrumming that matched the low industrial hum of the refrigerator downstairs. He rolled off the mattress, his feet hitting the floor with a soft thwack. He was pacing before he realized he'd even stood up. His fingers curled into fists so tight, his short fingernails bit into the meat of his palms. "He doesn't get it," he hissed to the empty corner of his room. "He doesn't even try," he muttered, kicking his sneaker against the bed frame. "You know what? He doesn't even matter." He felt a little guilty for thinking it, but it also felt true. He left his room, the hallway carpet rough under his socks. The house was an obstacle course of things that used to mean something. In the hallway stood the oak telephone table his father had spent 3 weekends sanding down until his forearms were white with sawdust. Now, it just held a bowl of dead batteries and loose pennies. Thomas glided past it, a shadow moving through a museum of abandoned efforts. Downstairs, the den was a cavern of blue television light. Through the cracked door, Thomas could see the silhouette of his father's head against the back of the recliner. The man didn't move. He hadn't moved for a whole hour. He just sat there, letting the light of a muted baseball game wash over his face, his fingers wrapped around a glass of melting ice. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, just a long, slow deflation of air from his father's nose. A sigh that sounded less like breath and more like a small structural collapse inside the man's lungs. To a man, it was the sound of a mortgage, of a joints-aching Tuesday, of the quiet panic of watching the world get more expensive while your hands got stiffer. But to 12-year-old Thomas, that sigh was a wall. It was a declaration that whatever was happening inside his father's head was far more important than anything Thomas could bring into the room. It was the sound of his father choosing the silence over him. Thomas hated that sigh. He hated it because it felt like a leak in the boat, and his father was just sitting there watching the water rise around their ankles. He turned his back on the den and walked into the dark kitchen. The linoleum was cold enough to make his toes curl. He didn't turn on the light. The moon through the window over the sink was enough to turn the room into a study of silver and slate. He stood before the junk drawer, the third one down, the one that smelled of old rubber bands and graphite. He pulled it open, the small wooden rollers groaning. His fingers scavenged through the debris of a household's minor failures. Broken crayons, instruction manuals for a toaster they'd thrown out 2 years ago. And finally, the heavy brass key. It was attached to a faded red plastic fob that said Craftsman in chipped white letters. He didn't take it out. He just pressed the pad of his thumb against the cold, notched teeth of the metal. That key belonged to the padlock on the shed out back. The shed that had been locked since the autumn Thomas turned 10. Through the kitchen window, the backyard stretched out like a dark, sleeping animal. In the far corner, nestled beneath the black lace of the overgrown willow trees, sat the shed. It looked smaller in the moonlight, a hunched, weather-beaten thing of grey cedar planks. When he was small, that shed had been a cathedral. It had smelled of cedar shavings, 3-in-1 oil, and the sharp vinegar tang of wood glue. His father used to live out there on summer nights, his shadow thrown massive against the yard by a single yellow floodlight. Thomas remembered the music, always old raspy country songs coming from a radio with a wire coat hanger for an antenna. He remembered the heavy, satisfying clack of a socket wrench meeting a bolt, a sound that meant something was being mended, that things could always be put back together if you had the right tool. Now, the floodlight bulb was shattered, a jagged tooth of glass still screwed into the socket. The radio was silent. The path through the grass had grown over with dandelion weeds and crabgrass, erasing the footprints of the man who used to walk it every evening. His father hadn't lost his tools, he just lost the desire to hold them. He'd locked the door one Sunday afternoon, dropped the key into the kitchen drawer, and simply walked into the house to become a ghost who watched television with the sound turned off. Thomas stared out at the dark silhouette of the roofline. His throat felt tight, clogged with the bitter, unripe anger of a boy who wanted his hero back, but didn't know how to ask for him without screaming. He wanted to take the key. He wanted to run out there, smash the padlock, and drag every wrench and saw out onto the lawn until his father had no choice but to look out the window and see the mess he was making. He left it, his mind whispered, the thought finally settling into the shape of a solid thing. He left the tools, he left the wood, he left you. Thomas let go of the key. The drawer slid shut with a soft wooden thud that felt entirely too final. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the kitchen window, watching the shed drown in the shadows of the willow trees, his own breath leaving a small, foggy circle on the pane that slowly disappeared into the dark. The next afternoon, the sun was still pinning the house to the ground, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway, when Thomas and his best friend Leo burst through the front door, their sneakers drumming a frantic beat on the hardwood. The house smelled like the lemon-scented industrial cleaner his mom used, a sterile, bright smell that felt at odds with the thick, brewing storm of adolescent energy Thomas carried in his chest. "Hey Mom," Thomas called out, his voice already strained with the need to be gone, to be separate. His mother looked up from the kitchen island, a notepad in hand, offering that distracted, pleasant smile that always made Thomas's teeth ache. She looked tired, but not the kind of tired that came from a long shift. It was the quiet, hollowed-out fatigue of someone who spent their days managing a house that refused to be managed. "We're going to my room," Thomas said, already halfway to the stairs. He didn't wait for her to acknowledge the privacy he was claiming. Upstairs, his room was a sanctuary of blue-lit screens and discarded clothes. They claimed the floor, controllers sliding into their palms like extensions of their own nervous systems. They spent the next 4 hours locked in the twitchy, adrenaline-fueled logic of a tactical shooter. It was the only time Thomas didn't feel like a placeholder. In the game, he was a precision instrument. He was efficient. He was necessary. When he fired, something hit. When he moved, he had a purpose. By the time the sun had bled out of the sky and the neighborhood had surrendered to the blue, cooling tide of evening, they were still at it. Thomas's room was dark, save for the jittery, artificial colors from the monitor dancing over their faces. Then, the game glitched, or at least, that's what Thomas told himself. Through the frantic, tinny audio of the game, the gunfire, the shouting, a sound cut through the room like a clean surgical incision. Clack, clack. It was the heavy, weighted sound of a socket wrench hitting a concrete floor. Thomas paused the game. His thumb hung mid-air over the button, his heart performing a sudden, violent somersault against his ribs. "What? You're glitching, man," Leo said, eyes still glued to the screen. "You had the flank." Thomas didn't answer. He held his breath, listening. The house was humming with its own quiet evening energy, the click of the AC, the distant rumble of the refrigerator. But beneath it, a faint, reedy melody began to bleed into the air. It was a radio, playing a song that sounded like it was being broadcast through a mile of water, scratchy and distorted. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from outside. From the back. He's going to leave the sandblaster out for tomorrow, a thought occurred to him. It was a strange, intrusive thought, one that didn't feel like his own. It was too cool, too analytical, lacking the hot, jagged temper he usually carried around. It felt like a stone dropping into a calm, dark pool. He didn't know who he was, his dad maybe, but his dad wasn't home yet. The thought just sat there, heavy and undeniable, reverberating in the center of his skull. "Did you hear that?" Thomas asked, glancing toward the window. Leo blinked, pulling his headset off. "Hear what? You mean the game audio? Music? Or something?" Leo frowned, listening for a second before shrugging. "Probably just neighbors, man. Come on, Respawn." Thomas turned back to the screen, but he couldn't focus. The internal thought, he's going to leave the sandblaster out, persisted, swirling in the back of his mind like smoke. He kept thinking about his dad, who would be pulling into the driveway any minute. His dad, who would walk through the door, hang up his coat, and retreat into the den. A man who had simply stepped off the treadmill of his own life. "It's just wood and rust," the voice whispered in his head. It had a strange, resonant quality, like a voice echoing in a hallway that was far too large. "But it needs a hand to turn the wrench." Thomas stood up, his legs feeling restless and buzzed with static. He walked to the window that looked out over the backyard. The grass was a sheet of slate grey under the rising moon, and there, against the black, skeletal silhouettes of the willows, the shed sat. It was dark, silent and dormant, but as he watched, a faint amber pulse, no larger than a match flame, flickered behind the boards. It breathed once, twice. Then, the distinct rhythmic zip-zip-zip of a handsaw slicing through dry timber drifted through the glass, soft as a secret. "He can't finish it without you, Thomas." Thomas gripped the window frame. He didn't feel scared. He felt a strange, cold clarity. He looked back at Leo, who was already running into a virtual firefight, completely oblivious to the fact that the backyard was busy building something out of thin air. "I'll be right back," Thomas said, his voice sounding flat to his own ears. "Whatever," Leo grunted, his fingers flying across the controller. Thomas walked out into the hallway. The house felt different, charged with a low-frequency hum that vibrated up through the soles of his feet. He walked to the top of the stairs, looking down into the dark, quiet throat of the foyer. He knew the key was in the kitchen junk drawer. He could see it in his mind's eye, sitting among the dead batteries and the tangled rubber bands. But he didn't move toward it. He couldn't. He just stood there, staring at the front door as the headlights of his father's car swept across the living room wall, feeling that strange, cold pulse from the backyard matching the beat of his own heart. The shed was waiting for someone to build something, and for the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he was the only one holding the tools. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressing against Thomas's eardrums with the weight of deep water. He stayed pressed against the pantry, his vision tunneling until the only thing in the world was the brass key resting on the island. It caught the late afternoon sun, throwing a perfect golden reflection against the ceiling, a beacon of invitation that felt entirely too intentional. His pulse was a frantic, irregular drumbeat in his throat. He looked toward the back door. Through the window, the yard stretched out, vast and meticulously kept, with the shed sitting at the far end like a punctuation mark on a long, empty sentence. The air in the kitchen didn't just feel heavy, it felt pressurized, causing the cabinet doors to vibrate in their frames with a faint, rhythmic clicking, as if someone were tapping a finger against the wood from the inside of the walls. "Don't just stand there," the voice whispered. It didn't come from his ears. It felt like a vibration in his very marrow, a resonant frequency that rattled his teeth. The time for waiting has passed. The work is nearly finished. Thomas took a stumbling step forward, his legs feeling like lead. His hand hovered over the counter. When his fingers brushed the brass, the kitchen lights didn't flicker. They grew brighter, a sterile surgical white that made the familiar room feel alien and overexposed. The key wasn't cold. It was vibrating against the granite with such intensity that it emitted a high, thin whine, a sound so precise it felt like it was cutting a line directly into his focus. He didn't want to pick it up. He wanted to run, but the house held him in a grip of quiet, suffocating gravity. "Why are you doing this?" he breathed, his voice barely a rattle. "Doing what?" The voice was deceptively gentle, the exact cadence of his father on a Sunday afternoon, showing him how to sand a block of pine. "I'm just working. Everything is finally in its right place." Thomas grabbed the key. The moment his skin closed around it, the kitchen felt strangely wide, the ceiling stretching upward until the pendant lights looked like distant, cold stars. When he looked at his hand, it was perfectly clean, but he could feel a phantom weight in his palm, a pressure that mimicked the exact shape of a tool handle. He turned toward the back door. The yard had transformed, not into something wild, but into something too orderly. The grass looked like a green carpet, every blade uniform, unmoving. The shed stood at the far edge, its door perfectly aligned, its windows catching the light with a sharp, blinding glint. He walked toward the door, his movement stiff. He reached the heavy door and pushed it open. He didn't even remember to tell Leo to let himself out. He didn't care. In the bedroom, the game continued to blare, the sounds of digital explosions and shouted dialogue, but it already felt like a broadcast from another planet. As Thomas reached for the door handle, he realized he didn't even know why he'd invited Leo over in the first place. That friendship now felt like interference, an unnecessary memory. The night air was unnaturally still. The world held in a breathless, static tension. He turned back to the kitchen counter, where the heavy plastic cooler sat waiting. He gripped the molded handles, the plastic digging into his palms, and hoisted it up. It felt impossibly light, yet it hummed against his ribs, a steady, mechanical vibration that matched the pulse in his head. He stepped out into the yard. The ground felt firm, unyielding, as if he were walking on polished concrete rather than soil. Each step he took seemed to erase the memory of the one before it. The vast lawn, usually a place of chaotic summer games, was now a corridor, a sterile path leading toward the only truth that mattered. The house behind him ceased to be a home. It became a shell, a hollow stage set for a life he no longer recognized. He realized then that he had never been the protagonist of this story. He was merely the apprentice, the carrier of the load, the boy tasked with delivering the final components to the altar of the shed. As he walked, the wind died entirely. The world became a singular focused point of existence. The weight of the cooler in his hands, the cold, vibrating bite of the key in his pocket, and the rhythmic sound emanating from the shed. It was no longer just the sound of a saw. It had deepened into a complex symphony of labor, the rasp of metal on metal, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a mallet against dense, unyielding material, and the soft, sibilant hiss of air escaping a pressurized chamber. It was the sound of something being crafted that had no name. The distance between the back door and the shed seemed to stretch, folding into an impossible geometry. He felt as though he had been walking for hours, yet the shed remained fixed at the horizon, a monument of absolute stillness. He caught himself looking at his own hands, expecting to see them aged, withered by the passage of this strange, elongated time, but they remained young, steady, and gripped tight to the cooler. The dread he felt was not the frantic terror of a trapped animal, but a slow, creeping realization of inevitability. He was moving toward a threshold that, once crossed, would render his old life impossible to return to. Almost there, the voice soothed, now sounding as if it were vibrating from within his own chest. "Can you hear it, Thomas? The perfection of the alignment. Everything he touches becomes immutable." He reached the door of the shed. He dropped the cooler. It landed with a sharp, heavy thud that didn't echo, as if the sound had been swallowed by the structure itself. The wood was cool to the touch, vibrating with a high-pitched, harmonic intensity that made his hand go numb. He looked at the padlock, then at the key in his hand. He realized with a jolt of cold clarity that the padlock was not there to keep people out, but to ensure that the process remained undisturbed. He wasn't the boy who was afraid of the dark anymore. He was the boy who'd been invited to the workbench, and for the first time in his life, he was terrified by how much he wanted to see the perfection that was waiting for him on the other side. He slid the key into the lock. It turned with a sound like a whisper, and as the door groaned open just an inch, a sliver of light, pure and blinding, spilled out to meet him. The door groaned open, not a mechanical creak, but the dull, thick sound of heavy timber rubbing against wet earth. The shed interior was bathed in a jaundiced, flickering amber that seemed to drag against the eyes, heavy and viscous. Thomas stepped inside, his bare feet meeting a floor that didn't feel like wood. It was coated in a fine, dark grit that shifted like sand under his weight, making no sound as he walked. The space was claustrophobic, the ceiling dipping low enough that he felt he had to hunch. Yet the shadows in the rafters seemed to recede into a distance that defied the shed's actual footprint. Hanging from the beams were rusted coils and half-finished frames, oscillating with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. They didn't swing. They shuddered in place, vibrating at a frequency that Thomas felt in his molars. In the center, bathed in that sickly light, stood his father, He was hunched over the workbench, his back to the door, his movements rhythmic and repetitive. Spread out before him on the scarred, oil-stained slab was a massive, pulsing structure. It was translucent, dark, and shifted with a slow, hypnotic consistency. A tidal wave of meat tethered to the table by thick obsidian cables that seemed to anchor the mass to the very foundation of the shed. His father leaned over it, clutching a set of heavy steel rasps and files. He drove the metal teeth into the soft, yielding surface. Zip, zip, zip. "You're late, kiddo." His father's voice was casual, the same tone he'd used 1,000 times to comment on the weather or the score of a game. He didn't look up. His focus was absolute, his shoulders set with the patient, quiet intensity of a man building a birdhouse. Thomas moved closer. The air near the bench felt cooler, the temperature dropping sharply, creating a localized chill that made the hair on his arms stand up. The silence of the suburban night outside, usually filled with the hum of crickets or the distant rumble of a car, was completely severed here, replaced by the internal rhythm of the shed. "I had to wait until Mum was asleep," Thomas said, his voice sounding flat in the small, crowded space. He didn't feel afraid. He felt expectant. "What are you working on?" "Just some fine-tuning." His father wiped his brow with the back of a hand smeared with a dark, tacky grit. He didn't turn around, but he shifted slightly, his movements jerky and uneven. "See how this side is bulging? It's not sitting right. If we don't get this smoothed down, it's going to keep knocking against the frame. It'll rattle the whole house apart if we aren't careful." Thomas leaned in. The mass was larger than it had been 2 nights ago. He watched his father's hands, steady, practiced, almost affectionate, as he took a file to a jagged protrusion on the organ's surface. Thomas didn't quite see the grotesquerie of the scene. He saw a project that needed doing, a problem with a clear, mechanical solution. "What do you need?" Thomas asked. "Grab me that mallet, the one with the heavy face," his father said, gesturing toward a rack of tools that looked less like hardware and more like a collection of surgical curiosities. "And hold this steady for me, would you? It's being a bit stubborn." Thomas stepped up to the bench. The surface was warm, unnaturally slick, and pulsed against his palms with a strength that suggested it was fighting back. He braced himself, his hands sinking slightly into the yielding, wet texture. The way his father focused, the absolute attention to the task, the quiet, rhythmic scrape of the rasp, made the world outside the shed feel thin and transparent. His bedroom felt like a distant grey memory. School felt like a dream he had woken up from hours ago. He watched the metal teeth bite into the mass. After a long pause, a moment that felt stretched, as if the air itself were holding its breath, his father stopped filing. He reached beneath the workbench and pulled out a small glass jar filled with a clear, viscous liquid. He poured it over the area he had been sanding. "You noticed the house lately, Thomas?" his father asked, his voice low and vibrating against the floorboards. "The foundation, it's shifting." "I don't know," Thomas said, his focus entirely on the way the liquid pooled in the crevices of the mass, turning a soft, pearlescent white. "It seems the same." "It's not. It's settling into a new shape." His father finally turned, but he didn't look at Thomas. He looked at the rafters, his gaze unfocused. His skin looked strangely matte in the amber light, lacking the usual texture of pores or creases. Things that aren't leveled correctly tend to lean. They reach for the ground. You have to force them to stand. He reached out and patted Thomas's shoulder. His hand was freezing, an arctic, biting cold that burned through Thomas's shirt. "You're getting better at this." The way you hold it, you have a steady hand." Thomas looked down at his own fingers, pressed deep into the warm, pulsing mass. He realized for the first time that his fingerprints had left indentations on the surface, and they weren't fading. The mass was holding the shape of his touch. "We have to be careful with the next part," his father added, returning to the workbench. He picked up a long, thin rod made of a material that looked like polished bone. "This is going to require more than just bracing. Are you ready to see how it's anchored?" Thomas nodded, though his heart was beginning to thump against his ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming sense of scale. He looked up at the shed ceiling again. The shadows were no longer just occupying the corners. They were cascading down the walls, weaving between the rusted coils and the hanging anatomy. They looked like long, spindly fingers reaching down, not to touch them, but to measure the space between the father and the son. The light flickered, the amber hue deepening to a bruised, dark orange. For a fleeting second, the shed seemed to tilt. Thomas felt his inner ear swim, the floor shifting beneath him, as if they were on a boat in deep, heavy water. He blinked, and the sensation passed, but the orientation of the workbench felt different than it had a moment ago. It was slightly further away, or perhaps the door had moved. "Hold it steady," his father whispered, his voice losing its casual tone and becoming something sharper, more urgent. "Don't let it drift. If it drifts, we lose the geometry." Thomas leaned in, his knuckles white, holding the mass as it began to quiver violently under the pressure of the bone rod. Outside, the world was silent, completely oblivious. But here, the hum was rising to a deafening harmonic scream. The routine had become a series of quiet, practiced maneuvers. Thomas waited for the front door to click shut behind his mother. The sound of her car pulling away providing the signal that the house was officially empty. His real father was usually still inside, likely in the den. His own schedule erratic, and his presence lately defined by a heavy, palpable exhaustion. He was just a man caught in the middle of a long, dull stretch of his life. And Thomas learned to move around that silence, careful not to disturb the dust. The shed was where the real work happened. Thomas slipped out the back, his movements becoming increasingly fluid, a shadow in his own yard. He didn't enjoy it, not in the way he used to enjoy helping his dad build birdhouses, but there was a necessity to it now. The mass on the workbench was growing, a complex, heavy structure that seemed to demand more attention with every passing day. He didn't go every day. He couldn't. The school bus still rumbled down the street at 7:30, and the pressure of attendance was a constant gnawing anxiety. By the third week of this, his grades were starting to dip, the crisp, clean edges of his assignments becoming smudged with that persistent dark grit that clung to his skin. "You're drifting again," his father said, his back turned, the zip, zip, zip of the file rhythmic and steady. "You're missing the alignment. If you don't hold it flush, the whole assembly loses its integrity." Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans, his palms stinging. "I can't stay all morning. I've already missed 3 days this week. My history teacher sent an email to the house. If they call, Mom is going to see it. If she sees it, I'm done." His father didn't turn. He just kept filing, his shoulders moving with that same, slightly jerky precision. "You're 12, Thomas. You're worried about grades, about being grounded. You think that's the threshold of trouble." "It is," Thomas whispered, his voice small in the crowded, humming space. "If Mum knows I'm not in class, she'll know I'm out here." "Then let them call," his father said, his voice flat, normal, and utterly nonchalant. He turned to his son, his expression softening into a familiar, steady warmth. the kind of look that used to anchor you, heavy with a quiet, unshakable reassurance that made the world feel small enough to handle. It's just school, Thomas. Just another construction. I can handle the noise. I can handle the interruption. How? I'll deal with the interruptions, his father said, gesturing toward the tool rack with a casual flick of his wrist. His father paused, a slow, deliberate movement that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. He reached down and pulled a bottle from the cooler. Not the crisp, sweating beer his real father usually favored after a long day, but one that sat warm and sluggish in the stagnant pool of meltwater. Without breaking eye contact, his father turned back to the workbench and picked up a pneumatic sander. He pressed the tool into the pulsating mass, the machine whining as it tore through the surface, sending a fine spray of dark grit into the air. "I need you to do something different today," he said, his voice barely rising above the whir of the sander. "Just leave the door unlocked this time, kiddo." A cold, jagged unease crept up Thomas's spine. Locking that door was more than just a habit. It was his anchor. He had always been careful to turn the key, to seal the shed tight, to ensure that whatever was happening in here remained walled off from the rest of his life. It was a bleak, frantic instinct, a way to keep the two worlds from bleeding into one another. Thomas glanced toward the closed door. He had locked it every single time. It was a reflex, as natural and necessary as breathing. "But," Thomas started, his stomach tightening into a knot. "It's okay now, kiddo," his father said, his tone as ordinary as a suggestion to mow the lawn. He didn't even look up from the work, his movements steady and surgical. "I'll make sure the school stops calling. You just worry about getting back to the house." Thomas felt the key in his pocket. It felt heavier than it should have, the metal cold, tacky, and vibrating with a faint, low-frequency buzz that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. He walked to the door, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven beat against his ribs. He turned to look back once. Usually, as soon as he stepped out, the amber light would vanish, the music would cut, and the shed would return to being a dark, empty box. He stepped out into the crisp morning air. He pushed the door shut, but he didn't pull it tight. He reached for the padlock dangling from the hasp, but instead of clicking it shut, he left it hanging wide open. He dropped the now useless key in the dirt before the door, watching the metal catch the morning sun, a sharp, cold glint against the dust. He started to walk toward the house, his pace quickening as the urge to look back fought with the instinct to run. He told himself he wouldn't. He told himself it was just a shed, and his dad was just being his dad, and he was just a kid in trouble at school. But as he reached the edge of the lawn, he couldn't help it. He glanced back over his shoulder. The shed door was still barely closed, the key slightly sticking from the dirt like a buried finger, and the amber light wasn't gone. It was pouring out of the gap, spilling across the grass in a long, jaundiced streak that didn't belong in the daylight. And from deep inside, he didn't hear silence. He heard the zip, zip, zip of the file, louder and faster than before, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to be vibrating the very dirt beneath his feet. The shed didn't just vibrate. It seemed to settle, a deep, structural groan that started in the foundation and worked its way up through the joists. It was a rhythmic thrum, 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 the same heartbeat that had kept time in the shed for weeks. For reasons he couldn't bring himself to name, Thomas steered clear of the shed for the next few days, lingering instead by the landline. He nursed a small, childlike hope that it would finally ring, that the teachers would call, that the hammer would drop, and that he would finally be in trouble, finally free of his obligations. All the while, he heard the work continue, the music swelling, creeping closer, and the light in the shed burning on, defiant in the dark. Then came a night, no more than 4 or 5 days in. The house had settled into the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping family. But Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, his palms pressed flat against a quilt that suddenly felt weighted, the fabric stiffening under his touch like drying hide. He heard it then, just as he had for nights, but because his parents seemed deaf to the sound, he had played the part of the oblivious son. No longer. He stood up, drawn toward the door and down to the kitchen, where the silence wasn't quite as absolute as it should have been. There was no talking, just the methodical zip, zip, zip of a RAS meeting, something soft and yielding, followed by the wet, slapping sound of material being layered and smoothed. He walked to the landing. The hallway light was pulsing in perfect synchronization with the thrum. Every time the light surged, the wallpaper pattern distorted, the floral print stretching and knotting as if it were struggling to rearrange itself into a new, more efficient geometry. "Dad," he whispered. There was no answer, only the steady, patient work from the kitchen. He descended the stairs. Each step felt firmer, the carpet compressing into something hard and unyielding. As he reached the bottom, he saw the kitchen door standing ajar. A thin, amber sliver of light spilled across the linoleum, cutting through the darkness like a blade. He stayed in the shadows of the hallway. The kitchen had been gutted, or rather, reconfigured. The granite island had fused with a massive, pulsing workbench, and the cabinets had been stripped of their wood to reveal a structural lattice underneath, dripping with a slow, translucent sap. His father stood at the center of the room, his back turned, carving into the cabinetry with a wood chisel. His movements were too precise, his back arched with a geometric perfection that looked agonizingly rigid. "It's not sitting right, Thomas," his father said without looking up, checking the alignment of the refrigerator with a level. "The whole room is out of alignment. If we don't notch these supports, the ceiling is going to start sagging by morning. You can't have a structure that doesn't respect the load-bearing requirements." Thomas looked toward the living room archway. The chair where his father usually sat was gone, replaced by a thick, fibrous cord running from the floor to the ceiling, thrumming with that relentless amber vibration. A cold spike of nausea hit him. He didn't ask where his parents were. He felt the house answering for him. He noticed a section of the wall near the archway. The drywall was soft, porous, and warm. Beneath the paint, he saw a faint, distorted shape, the unmistakable curve of a shoulder, pressed tight against the studs, motionless and perfectly still. He turned toward the stairs, lunging upward. He needed to be sure. He pushed open his parents' bedroom door. The room was untouched, a frozen tableau in a house currently being disassembled downstairs. His mother and father were in bed. They were lying side by side, perfectly flat, staring up at the ceiling with wide, vacant eyes. "Mom, Dad." Thomas stepped into the room, his pulse a frantic, dull thud. They weren't breathing. Their skin had lost its warmth, turning the same dull, muted off-white of the bedsheets. They looked like statues carved from the room's own architecture. He reached out and touched his father's hand. It wasn't cold, but it felt hollow, like touching a piece of drywall. There was no resistance, no weight. They weren't dead. Not in the way he understood death, but they weren't there. The life had been siphoned out of them, repurposed into something else, something structural. They were just husks, placeholders holding their spot in the floor plan. Thomas pulled his hand back, a numb, cold regret settling deep in his chest. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a leaden realization. He couldn't save them. He didn't even know how to begin to try. The house had already claimed them. He backed out of the room, closing the door softly, as if afraid of waking someone who was already gone. He didn't lock his bedroom door. He didn't even go back to his bed. The house didn't need him to hide anymore. It needed him to finish the work. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in a house that no longer sounded like wood and plaster. The kitchen doorway was gone, replaced by a wide, pulsating archway that bled a thick amber light into the foyer. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need to be told. The lethargy that had been dragging at his limbs vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. He walked into the kitchen, or what used to be the kitchen, and saw his father standing by the front door. The door was already unspooling, the frame dissolving into a lattice of raw, structural fibers that reached out toward the street, toward the neighbor's driveway, toward the rest of the silent, unsuspecting suburb. His father turned, his face a mask of perfectly calm, parental expectation. He held out a fresh wood chisel, the handle already stained with that dark, tacky grit. "The internal load is balanced, Thomas," his father said, his voice resonating through the very floorboards they stood on. "But the perimeter is still soft. If we don't square the exterior, the whole neighborhood will drift." Thomas took the tool. His hands didn't tremble. The nausea he had felt upstairs was gone, replaced by the same intoxicating focus he had felt back in the shed. He looked at the front door, at the way the house was already beginning to weave itself into the evening air, preparing to reach out and claim the next frame. He knew now why he hadn't been integrated like his parents. They were the foundation, the husks used to stabilize the initial structure. He was the craftsman. He was the one who knew how to hold the tension. "The neighbors are going to notice the vibration," Thomas said, his voice flat and steady. "Not if we move quickly," his father replied, stepping aside to let Thomas reach the threshold. "They'll just see a renovation. They'll just see a house being made level. By the time they realize the floor plan has changed, they'll be part of the floor plan themselves." Thomas stepped up to the archway. The air outside was cool, but it felt thin, weak, unleveled. He looked down the street at the rows of houses, all of them standing at slight, uneven angles, all of them sagging with the weight of their own disorganized, messy lives. He felt a surge of pride, cold and sharp. He could fix that. He could make it all square. He raised the chisel and struck the first blow against the foyer floor, the sound ringing out like a command. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a blueprint. And as the house shuddered, stretching its joists out toward the neighboring porch, Thomas bent to his work, perfectly content to spend the rest of his life making sure nothing ever went out of alignment again.